afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Enders Wimbush from the Hudson Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you to what I think will be an exceptionally interesting, fruitful, and lively session as we discuss a new and very important book. Before I go any further, let me do the obligatory warning. Please turn off your cell phones and your iPhones and all of that stuff, because they will, in fact, interfere with the audio. So turn them right off if you'd be so kind. I also want to welcome viewers who are watching this being streamed on the internet. This is a new feature for Hudson. We are going to be doing a lot more of it. We appreciate your feedback and your comments and your suggestions for how we can make it better. And of course, to all of you, the audience, we hope that when you're not able to attend in person any of the events that appeal to you, that in fact you will go to our website where the instructions, I'm told, are plain and clear, and you'll be able to follow along with us in real time. We're here today to launch in the United States a new book, The Long View from Delhi, whose author, Admiral Raja Menon, is here with us today. He is well known, I think, to almost all of you. For those of you who do not know him well or do not know his extraordinarily impressive biography, Admiral Menon was a career naval officer, finishing his naval career as the Assistant Chief of the Naval Staff for Operations, one of the most critical and prestigious jobs in all of the Indian military. But he's also well known to all of us as a great strategist, having written extensively on nuclear strategy, on maritime strategy, and increasingly on developing the means for strategic analysis in India, particularly through his assistance to the National Security Council of India in creating a net assessment capability. With us on the panel today, also known to all of you, are Lisa Curtis, an old friend from a political campaign that we won't talk about. This candidate didn't win, and Sarah Palin didn't jump in to help us. Lisa is, of course, a well-known analyst of South Asia and strategic affairs generally. She is a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation. And Ashley Tellis, who also needs no introduction. Ashley's biography and accomplishments are so extensive that I won't even attempt them, and he will deny all of this. But just suffice it to say that those of us who are in the know understand that Ashley is certainly the most important principle in establishing the current U.S.-India relationship at the high strategic level that it currently enjoys. He's going to deny it, but don't listen to him. He did it.
He already did.
He's the guy. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, India began looking out from its shell, so to speak, from its focus inward on self-sufficiency and self-reliance. It was embarking on a long series of very positive economic reforms, and those had strategic import. Coinciding with this, the end of the Cold War arrived, and the view from New Delhi at that point must have been rather sobering, because if you were an Indian strategist or a specialist in national security and defense matters, and you looked out from New Delhi in 1992 or 1993, you would have seen challenges on all sides. China was simmering with energy, not the least from the effects of its robust economy, and it was entertaining very significant new strategic ambitions. Pakistan was continuing its long series of challenges with good governance, social stability, and was experiencing more frequently than what we've come to see more of, the effects of terrorism. Afghanistan was headed into a new round of conflict about which we are still involved today. Central Asia, India's traditional strategic depth was unstable. The states had not consolidated themselves effectively. All kinds of new actors were inhabiting this space, competing for influence, competing for opportunities to advance their own particular strategic and national interests. Iran was headed toward becoming a nuclear state. And in the critical area of energy security, on which India is highly dependent, all they had to do in 1993 or 1994 was look to the Gulf and the instability that enwrapped it, and they knew that their energy umbilical cord to that part of the world was extremely tenuous, and more and more. It was about this time that a new generation of Indian strategists really began to come into their own. There are, of course, a number of them, very well known to all of you. K. Subramaniam, for many years the dean of Indian strategists, C. Raja Mohan, who has written more recently. But none of them, in my view, really captured the essence of how one analyzes the competitive forces and dynamics on an emerging security landscape quite the way Admiral Menon has done. The book that he has brought to us today is in some respects the consummation of his thinking to date on how one looks at that landscape. He has asked the critical questions. What will the world that India is entering in the next couple of decades look like? And how does India secure its vital interests in that world? How does she compete on this landscape when there are other actors all pursuing their vital interests, and those vital interests may easily conflict? What kinds of new capabilities does India need? What kinds of new strategies does she need to design? And what kinds of new relationships and alliances are necessary to get those strategies into place and make them work effectively? What is the shape of the larger competitive stage? Who are the actors? What are their objectives? What kinds of strategies are they designing to pursue their objectives? And where might those strategies either converge to make something larger than the sum of their parts, or collide that could result in contingencies that affect India directly or indirectly? All of that is addressed and more in Admiral Menon's book, which I commend to you with my strongest recommendation, just as I commend him to you with an even stronger one at this moment, to tell you how he got where he went with this book, how he's thinking about the long view from Delhi, what's in that view, how long it is, and how we should all be thinking about it together. Admiral Menon?
Thanks, Andy. Anders, Lisa, Ashley, ladies and gentlemen, the fact that so many of you in Washington have decided to take time off from a working day to come here is truly humbling. I'm very grateful. Thank you very much. I must first of all recognize many in the audience with whom I have had long associations over the last 10 or 15 years. And I must say I've learned to regard and respect you, although sometimes we've agreed to disagree. As Ender says, the title of this book is The Long View from Delhi, Scenarios to Define the Grand Strategy of Indian Foreign Policy, 2025. I'll frankly admit that the title is inspired by the seminal theoretical work on scenario writing by Peter Schwartz, The Art of the Long View. And this particular book began as a project in a Delhi think tank called ICRIA, the director of which is Rajiv Kumar and my co-author in this book. It was tasked by the MEA to try and write what foreign policy should be in 2025. But I rapidly broke away from that group because they decided to ask any number of experts on what should foreign policy be. They didn't see that what I saw, which is that it was mandatory to define the world in 2025 before addressing policy. And and this is a lesson that has been brought home to me by none other than Enders himself, who, under the tutelage of Andrew Marshall, the great net assessment guru of yours for the last 4 decades, came to India almost 12, 13 years ago and introduced us to the tools of net assessment. I have seen this, the usefulness of this, what I might call a humbler approach to policy, which is to say that you cannot address policy unless you know what the area that you're addressing at, how that area will evolve on its own. And we've seen this in the case of the smallest country around India, Sri Lanka. Now, you might think that Sri Lanka is not going to shake the world. Yeah, this is true. But in the last 10 years, we've seen how language, religion, societal changes, employment, economics, great power politics has pulled this country in directions which was totally unexpected. So an attempt to write policy without defining scenarios, I think, is catastrophic. So this is the reason why I broke away from that group. But I will happily concede that the group consisted of a number of experts on United States, Pakistan, Russia, arms control, global warming, and issues like that. And I've used their inputs in defining the smaller scenarios in this book. Nothing like this has been attempted earlier. And both Rajiv and I realized that we were taking on a task which might not, in fact, I'm not sure that it has worked out. But I expect that people would like to criticize the book. In fact, I hope you do criticize the book. All we think is that it may not be the last book on the subject, but it's the first book. So we would like to compare ourselves to the Wright brothers. I looked at the record. You might be interested to know that the Wright brothers flew only 120 feet. Now, we may have flown only 120 feet with this, but this is the first attempt for India. And if you do criticize it, I'd be happy, because that means you have read the book, for which you'll have to buy it. The director of ICRIA, Dr. Rajiv Kumar, was happy. He happily agreed to co-author, and I was happy to have him, because in the projects that I've since done, it's become very clear that power flows from wealth. And writing holistic scenarios without understanding the economic factors that go into it would make poor scenarios. I mean, I don't need to address this at you. In your competition, in your 45-year competition with the Soviet Union, I understand that at the height of Soviet power, they generated barely 35% of your GDP. And you saw what the result is. By 2025, we think that India will, at best, can aspire to be a regional power. And the countries that we have looked at are the US, China, Russia, Japan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Iran, Central Asia, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. You might think that there is an inordinate concentration on neighbors. This is true, and I will explain this later. Immediately after the book launch, seeing the countries that we addressed, I ran into very heavy weather with the French ambassador. who wondered why the EU is not in this. Now, this is an issue which is contentious, and we can contend with in the question hour, but we stick to our stand on the countries that we've chosen. Nevertheless, a globalized world will need us to look at all the influences that flow otherwise. And this we have done by looking at issues which will force us to interface with all the remaining countries too. And the issues, there are 10 issues, which includes hydrocarbon and energy, arms control, non-proliferation, space, terrorism, climate change, water, population and food, global trade, nuclear weapons, and military capability. The only aspect that we have not covered extensively is India. And there are reasons for this. It may be a matter of convenience, but we soon realized that looking at India's futures would be as big, if not bigger, than this book. So we had to take a call on whether in 2020 we would be somewhere where this book would be relevant. And we agreed that we would. But was there a make or break issue as far as India was concerned? An issue that might actually make India and which could also break India? There is one issue like that. And we identified that as social stability arising from the huge youth bulge that will occur between now and 2025. And that is dealt with in this book. So in all, we looked at something like 95 drivers of 11 countries and another 64 drivers of 10 issues. So that's something like 21, 22 subjects. In fact, we altogether looked at something like 159 drivers. But writing the smaller scenarios that arose in all these 21 issues was not very difficult. It required concentration. It might have been tedious, but it wasn't difficult. But stitching these 21 issues together into global scenarios, that was something quite else. It was difficult and it was very interesting. The question was, what would be the major scenario defining drivers for the global scenarios? And the United States chose itself. It appears as the deciding factor in 39 or 40 out of the 159. And China followed closely with 27. Now, this is not a revelation. We could have arrived at that without the numbers. But what we were really interested in is the uncertainty of these scenario-defining drivers. In other words, is there any uncertainty about the United States? Is there an uncertainty about China? And in that sense, we were a bit surprised, especially when we spoke to the experts on the United States. We said, 10 years ago, there would have been no uncertainty about the United States. Today, there is an uncertainty. But as many of you who've written geopolitical scenarios, alternate scenarios at the global level are produced by swing states. Now, which are the swing states? Many in India still continue to believe that the swing states are probably Russia and Japan. We didn't come to that conclusion. And we eliminated Russia and Japan as swing states, mainly because whatever the governments seem to be doing in these two countries seem to be in total variance with what the women in those countries think. And unless those governments can create a society in which they carry their women along, we don't see a bright future for either of them. But coming back to the United States, just before we began our work on this book, there were a couple of books published in the United States that predicted the decline of the United States. And it was a question of varying as to how fast or how soon. But we as net assessment people, we are not into predictions. And secondly, one of the commentators here, in fact, Ashley, he's produced a very fine work on the comprehensive national power of the United States. Now, what Ashley has done in that book he's described the structure of how the United States creates power. And I completely agree with that model, which is that the United States is an innovative society. And it innovates and creates technology with which it does three things simultaneously. One is it creates wealth, it creates military power, and it creates institutions that enable it to transform technology into wealth and power. I go along with that model. So we are convinced, Rajiv and I, that the United States has still got a lot going for it. And it is very much capable of another spurt, the kind of spurt that it did in the early 20th century when Ford created the mass production of automobiles. And later on in the 20th century when you spurted again with the internet revolution. We have created scenarios where we think that there are technological scenarios which the United States will exploit and spurt once again. But at the same time, scenario writing means alternative scenarios. So we've also looked at the areas which I'll put in an omnibus term as describing it as, when countries start bending to the Chinese wind. Now, this is something that we think will begin to happen, but how much they will bend and how long they will bend is something that you'll have to read the book to find out. There are three more big ideas that I will quickly run through. One of them is that I said there's a seeming preoccupation of India with its neighbors. And there is a reason for this. For whatever reasons, our neighbors have, according to the drivers that we have chosen, seem to have futures which border on the grim. Now, let's take them one at a time. One is Pakistan. Every Indian is an expert on Pakistan. And that creates a problem because there's a huge amount of noise through which you can't see the signal coming through. But as net assessment specialists, we're not concerned with what it does in FATA and PATA and all that. What we are concerned with is with a GDP growth of 2% and a fertility rate of 5%, this country is heading for trouble. And whether it solves Afghanistan to its satisfaction or not is not the issue. The issue are these factors. In any case, its population is going to stabilize between 300 and 350, lower rate, higher rate. With either 300 or 350 as an agrarian society, it hasn't got the water to survive. Bangladesh is afflicted with serious geographical problems. Again, for an agrarian society, Bangladesh's persons per hectare is 12 compared to 4 and 3.5 for Pakistan and India. Today it's 12. And by 2050, it will have to stabilize at anything between 18 and 20. So what we are suggesting is that as agrarian societies, Bangladeshis cannot survive within Bangladesh. And we know the consequences. There are an unknown number of Bangladeshis in India. So the future of our neighbors is fraught. I know that President Manmohan thinks that a rising tide will lift all boats. Can India spurt leaving its neighbors behind? Well, you spurted leaving Mexico behind. Is that a model? We're not sure, because the world is different today from what it was. But is there a tipping point when we'll have to cut the ropes connecting us to our neighbors if we have to continue to grow? This is the issue that is dealt with in this book. The second big idea is the rise of China. Now, there's so much literature that comes from China. I don't really want to go into the specifics of this. In fact, a lot of the people who generate that literature are sitting right in this room. But in our opinion, if China was a multi-party democracy, we could live with it. But in our opinion, no matter what people say, China is a communist power. Power, we think, flows from the CMC. And if you want to get into the CMC from the Army, Navy, or Air Force, we know what the career profile of an officer should be. So if the country still believes that power grows from the barrel of a gun, and the armed forces owe loyalty to the party and not the constitution, that's a communist country. So if you say that China is turning capitalist, we're not convinced. Particularly because there are conflicting statistics which show that 91% of the millionaires are children of Communist Party members. That is communism living in peace with capitalism, yes, but the way the state behaves will be as a communist power. We also think that China is hurtling. I can't think, with shortage of time, I can't think of better words than to describe its strategy of dealing with internal dissent. China has to hurtle. And we also think that countries that need to continuously hurtle could also stumble. So we are fairly convinced that this business of creating export-led growth, riding on the back of an undervalued yuan and dumping money in other countries to avoid having to put it into US treasuries, is not a sustainable future. So the stumble is something that we are convinced about. What we are not convinced about is what will it do once it stumbles. Will it quickly pick itself up and continue, or will it pick itself up much slower? Now, these are the alternative scenarios as far as China is concerned. Lastly, the big question: is there a policy input for US-India relations? This is a question that I really shouldn't answer because I'm a scenario writer. Policy is the business of government, governments with big bureaucracies. But as I told the bureaucracy in India, at least this book has been written by 2 people writing scenarios, but that's 2 people more than you employed in writing scenarios. So we should really finish where scenarios finish. But in my previous avatar in the National Security Council, I kept coming across people in senior positions in government who kept saying, but if you know so much about the scenarios, why don't you also tell us what to do? Now, this is something which is a dividing line between scenario writers and policymakers. But I'm happy to say that if you were to read the book, the policy options stare you in the face. And one of these policy options that stare you in the face is a US resurgent with India riding on its coattails. There's no question about that. Does this form the background of what could be a revolutionary future for US-India relations? I think it is there. But as scenario writers, we also have to be very careful about answering the other questions about what if it didn't, or what if it did. So both options are there in the book. In conclusion, I just want to say this, that in the last 10 years, India has decided to go in for the National Security Council and the National Security Advisor. Because as Enders quite rightly said, as we see our capability and our wealth increasing, we find the need to pull ministries together to create coherent policy. But at the same time, we are halfway through these reforms in the sense that we've got the National Security Council and we have a National Security Advisor, but we don't have a system of issuing national security directives or memoranda. What really binds the ministries together in the parliamentary system is only the issuance of a cabinet paper. I think that getting ministries together and to work together in the absence of a national security directive or memorandum could probably flow a bit smoother if they were working on the same scenarios. Now that is a work in progress which we are taking up with the government. And I think with that I will finish and be very interested to hear what Lisa and Ashley have to say.
Lisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you very much, Enders, for inviting me here today. It's wonderful to be here, Admiral Menon, and with Ashley as well. It's certainly an honor to be able to comment on such an extraordinary book. I have read it. I didn't have to pay for it, but maybe this is my fee. It's a rich, all-encompassing study looking into the future, looking at the most critical countries as well as issues that will impact Indian foreign policy over the course of the next decade. And it certainly will be helpful to Indian policymakers as they consider how their current policies can help shape the future direction, not only of South Asia, but indeed globally as well to some extent. It provides a framework to begin considering what could happen in the key countries, the US, China, Japan, Russia, so that effective policies can be employed to deal with these emerging global scenarios. And I really enjoyed reading this book. I formerly worked at the CIA in the late 90s, and that was at a time where we were just beginning to do sort of red team studies, alternative analysis, and it was even a hard sell there to show the value of such kind of scenario or out-of-the-box thinking, if you will. And I think it's very important. But even though I say out of the box, I must say that this study is extremely realistic. It doesn't look too far into the future. Looking out 10 years is very reasonable. It's the long term, but I don't think it's too far into the future so as to make it irrelevant for current policy making. And I think the most interesting aspect of each chapter for me was looking at the main drivers in each country and trying to consider their predictability. And looking at these two aspects, the drivers and each driver's, whether or not it would be predictable as a way to project the future, was extremely helpful in thinking about it. And I think this type of analysis or net assessment is useful because it helps policymakers think about what policies they can pursue that would have the greatest impact. It helps illuminate what is within the realm of the possible to change and what may be simply impossible to change. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. I'm going to comment mainly on the policies or the scenarios that are developed for the US, Pakistan, and China, because clearly these are the countries of most interest as India moves forward with its foreign policy. So as Admiral Menon, I think, mentioned, the study posits 4 major outcomes revolving around the US and China. The first one, and he mentioned this, is what comes clear is in India's interest, is that the US reinvents itself, remains the sole superpower. The second, the US declines relative to China. The third, US and China both grow, and there's the duopoly of power, or the proverbial G2. Or fourth, both China and the US begin to decline economically, and thus China becomes more aggressive. And I think one of the parts that jumped out to me in particular was the importance for India of the future course of US policies toward Afghanistan and Pakistan, something that is very current for us right now. And certainly the study notes that a US withdrawal from the region would leave China to fill the void. And so the study essentially equates a strong US with a more stable Afghanistan and Pakistan, certainly in India's interest. The study acknowledges that a strong US role in South Asia that helps lift up the countries, Afghanistan, Pakistan, but also to some extent Bangladesh, would be to India's benefit. And I think this is very interesting because if we look at the past, as Enders was talking about, there has been a lot of suspicion about any U.S. role in South Asia. So I think we've come a long way if India is starting to see that the U.S. actually has a very positive role to play. And I think U.S. policymakers have long been trying to convince Indian officials that U.S. abandonment or isolation of Pakistan in particular would not actually be in India's interest. And I think as the situation has become more volatile in Pakistan, this point has become more sellable in India. But I would just point out that this is a two-way street in that the U.S. also needs India to help stabilize the region. And I believe India could and should be consulting more closely with the U.S. on Afghanistan. And the two countries do share the overall goal of not allowing that country to again turn into an international terrorist safe haven. So I think there's more consulting, there's more cooperation that can be done. Certainly, I think Indian officials have been skeptical of U.S. policy toward Afghanistan more recently and feel there has been some mixed signals sent on India's role in Afghanistan. But the latest strategic dialogue that occurred just a couple of weeks ago, I believe helped to clarify that the U.S. does indeed appreciate India's role in developing the economy, fostering democracy. Ambassador Romer visited Indian development projects in Afghanistan. There was talk of some possible joint India-U.S. development initiative in Afghanistan. And I think all of this bodes well, and it shows that we're likely to see better U.S.-India cooperation in Afghanistan moving into the future. But I just want to point out here, I don't think that the U.S. should be in the business of balancing Indian and Pakistani interests in Afghanistan. That is not what the Afghanistan mission is about. The U.S. should simply be supporting those activities that are contributing to strengthening the Afghan government and the democratic process there, and countering those activities that destabilize the country. The focus should be on what's best for the Afghans, not on giving any one country more influence than another. And I think that people are beginning to move in this direction, but I do sense there was some confusion within the administration about whether or not the focus should be on balancing these two countries' interests, and I don't think that's a productive policy to follow. Now, the section on Pakistan is very interesting. I think the drivers on Pakistan are very illuminating, and I highly recommend looking at that chapter. Well, looking at the whole book, but that chapter in particular. And I think what jumped out at me was the army. The Pakistan Army is the driver. It's designated as the most important driver, but also the most predictable. And I think this is the paradox that we see with the Pakistan Army. It is the institution that has helped foster the growth of religious extremists in the country, but it is this same institution that we will have to rely on to act as a bulwark against these very forces, preventing them from consuming the country or taking the reins of power. Interestingly, in the triggers and response section of the Pakistan chapter, the report very much counsels Indian patience. And it notes the importance of India making trade concessions to Pakistan. And it lists out the downstream impact of Pakistan shifting its focus from the Indian border to its western border along Afghanistan. And I think this is useful. I think it is useful to imagine best case scenarios for Pakistan. Only when we can imagine these scenarios can we begin to pursue policies that move us in that direction. But I was struck that the triggers and response section only focused on policies to be pursued for this more sort of rosy scenario in Pakistan. For instance, there was no mention of how India would cope with a situation in which terrorism runs rampant in the region, or India experiences major attacks from Pakistan like those in Mumbai in 2008, with those occurring more frequently. So, I guess I was just left with wanting to know a little bit more about how India might be thinking about those different possible scenarios. There's also a very interesting section on terrorism, and I think this is a critical chapter to the overall scenarios. It highlights the dangers of terrorist ideology combining with goals for social reform, looking at what Maulana Fazlullah tried to do in the Swat Valley. And it notes the dangers of a similar phenomena developing in the Punjab, in the Pakistani Punjab. And it rightly points out that such a scenario could end up splitting the Pakistan army, which would completely destabilize the country. And I want to quote this. I think it's very important because the study does note that the presence of a moderate Muslim nation, i.e. Pakistan, would have been the best buffer to tackle Islamic fundamentalism. And so this shows that, rather than, the old dated thinking of India wanting instability in Pakistan or, feeling that's going to help with Indian interests, I think there's very much a recognition in India that no, a stable Pakistan is what is in India's interest. And I correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this feeling is starting to pervade the Indian strategic establishment. And as Admiral Menon pointed out, very interesting comparisons between Pakistan and Bangladesh. I think it's useful as we're trying to think about scenarios and frame our thinking to do some of this comparison. And I think the study rightly notes that the dangers of Islamist extremism are more urgent in Pakistan, yet the issue of land population to land ratio is certainly more urgent in Bangladesh. Now, on China, obviously this is a key part of the book. And the book indicates that China's rise is a pervasive driver for the direction of the other South Asian states, and makes recommendations that India increase its interaction with both Taiwan and Japan, and think more strategically about burden sharing in the event that China takes a more aggressive stance, and there needs to be a joint diplomatic military way to deal with the situation involving Vietnam, Indonesia, Japan. And it recommends that India should leverage its superior tactical position in the Indian Ocean. But I think the report is quite realistic when it comes to the gaps in the Chinese and Indian economies. It cautions against making too many comparisons between the two countries and the stage of economic development they're at. And I think that's quite useful. So in conclusion, I would just say that I think it's in the U.S. interest for India to begin to develop this grand strategy and to be proactive in seeking to shape both the regional and, to some extent, the global environment. Even though India is behind China in economic terms, it has many other assets to project power in positive ways. And I think initiatives such as India joining the tripartite U.S.-Australia-Japan dialogue, India holding joint military exercises with other East Asian, Southeast Asian nations, and seeking other kinds of engagement in this region should certainly be encouraged by the U.S. And on Pakistan, I would argue that New Delhi and Washington should reach beyond that old paradigm of seeing themselves as having divergent objectives or divergent intentions when it comes to Pakistan. Because I think, at least for the moment, both Washington and New Delhi are in agreement that things could get much worse in Pakistan, and that the priority should be encouraging an equilibrium within the system and doing nothing that sets the country in a wrong direction. And I think this is why we see enormous restraint in New Delhi, despite the fact that there are still militant groups in Pakistan. There has not been firm action to deal with some of these groups, and we could talk about the many reasons for that happening. But despite that, I think we see enormous restraint in New Delhi, and I think it is because of this very fact that there is a realization that things could get a lot worse. So I'm just going to stop my remarks there, but it's a wonderful book. I highly recommend it. It really helps frame the thinking, and it helps understand the role that India can play both regionally and globally, and how this should be encouraged. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa.
Ashley, we turn to you.
Thank you, Anders, for inviting me this afternoon. Thank you, Raja, for writing a great book. And thanks, Lisa, for that really superb overview of what the book is about. Let me just start by saying that I really commend this book for all your reading and reflection, because it's in many ways the cheater's cliff notes to grand strategy. If you wanted to, within 2 covers, get a feel for what the variables are that impact India in terms of the choices that it has to make, the constraints that it is up against, and the broad alternatives, this is the book that you need to look at. It's also a very easy read, so you can actually read it in an afternoon quite sensibly, though it's obviously demanding if you want to start thinking about it, because it's really a multi-step approach, as Lisa pointed out, trying to put together the building blocks of how to think clearly. I'm not going to talk about the book for very much longer, because I think Lisa did a great job of laying out how the book is structured and what it intends to do. I want to take off, rather, from the subtitle of the book, which is thinking about an Indian grand strategy and what is required for the success of an Indian grand strategy. And I would argue that once one assumes a certain set of constraints, the 3 things that are necessary for the success of a grand strategy are good ideas, robust institutions, and resourceful individuals. I want to talk about each of these 3 elements in the context of India. I think Raja's book fits in the first category. It fits in the category of ideas. Its contribution is to help the reader and the policymaker begin to understand what the challenges confronting India are and what its opportunities would be in different alternative worlds. It's a very hard task to do, and it's an even harder task to do right, because it requires systematic thinking, and it requires thinking in really what is a gigantic matrix with multiple cells, where each elements on the X and the Y axis interact in very complex ways. And so this book is very useful because what it does is it does the hard work for you. And whether you agree with Raja's preferred grand strategy or whether you disagree with it, I think that is less material. What is important is that he's laid out a framework for thinking about the problem. And anyone can choose to kind of do a test of manipulating different elements in the cells to see how you come out. So this is really a resource, it's a compendium for policymakers. Unless you do this, you really cannot expect that the country or its leadership will be able to shape outcomes or shape the world that they wish to see. But you've got to understand it first. And to understand it, as Aristotle said, you've got to break it up into its constituent parts, and you've got to see how the parts interact. This book is an exercise in extended Aristotelian logic. I want to talk about 2 other elements which go beyond the book, but are very essential to success and are very important if Raja's vision of having an effective grand strategy is to be realized. And that is the institutional dimension and the cultural dimensions which come very quickly to the issue of whether there are resourceful individuals. When one thinks about India and when one reads the book, one is left at the end of the reading with the sense of, this is a great book. I have all the ideas I need now with respect to what is to be done. But excuse me, who's going to do it? And you come face to face with two dimensions of, first, whether the right institutions exist in India to do this kind of grand strategy in the way that Raja would want to have it done. And two, whether the institutions that do exist actually have sufficient capacity. That is, they can actually pull it off. As Raja himself alluded very briefly when he described the National Security Council, I would go further and say that at the moment, there is no institutional apparatus in India that can do grand strategy. And I don't mean the absence of think tanks or the absence of bright people in the universities. Obviously, those exist. But as anyone who has worked in a government knows, there is the government and there is everything else. And a lot of things can happen in the everything else part. But if there is no connectivity between the everything else and the government, or better still, if there are no institutions within the government that can either more or less effectively reproduce what is being done in the everywhere else, it is highly unlikely that governments will actually do what is recommended. And so one of the first tasks, in a sense, for India to move in the directions that Raja identifies would be for itself to take a long and hard look at its institutional capacity. And whether there are, in fact, institutions in the bowels of the Indian government that can do this hard work of thinking through what India's choices are in what is very clearly a world in flux. Now, in saying this, I'm not criticizing, even by implication, what exists. Because the institutions that exist in India were institutions that were designed to enable India to operate in a world that was relatively stable. And in a world that is relatively stable, the task of grand strategy is essentially the task of maintaining a regime, of essentially maximizing your gains in a world that is not particularly changing in any dramatic way. And so India's strategic institutions are really designed for the India that was characterized by the Hindu rate of growth. Slow evolution, evolution whose end states could be discerned from afar, and therefore an institutional capacity that was not designed to leapfrog, anticipate, deal with surprises, deal with shocks. So if you posit that there is a universe that is relatively stable, India's institutions are great. But the world that Raja is describing, and the alternative worlds that he's describing, irrespective of what probability one assigns the occurrence of those worlds, they force you to reckon with the possibility that the world that exists is not ultra-stable, that there are a variety of possibilities, some of which are very complex, some of which are probably not even anticipated in the book. To be able to deal with this world, I would argue that India's current institutions simply are not appropriate to the task. And one of the key lacunae that currently exists is intra-governmental capacity to think systematically in the model that is illustrated in Raja's book. The government of India makes its decisions fundamentally on the basis of the intuitions of a few key policymakers. Those intuitions are given a rough and ready test through a bureaucratic process that involves a very, very thin layer of the upper bureaucracy. Every member of this thin layer of the upper bureaucracy is fundamentally a generalist, is more often than not a diplomat. None has specialized education. None is well versed with the intricacies of what the modern international system demands, whether it's economics or strategy or the environment or what have you. But on the basis of good upbringing, superior caste wherever possible, a fine training in an institution that has a heritage going back 100 years, you get what are at best judgments based on intuition and a little education. This has to change if the kind of change that Raja is hoping to prepare the country for would take place. And let me just flag 3 or 4 dimensions which I think are going to be very important because they'll make the difference. First, it's a common complaint in India and abroad that it has a gargantuan bureaucracy. I think that's not true. It does have a gargantuan bureaucracy. But the bureaucracies that matter with respect to national security decision making are actually very small. In fact, they are far smaller than is necessary for sustained reflection of the kind that Raja would see disseminated throughout the government. The number of people who are genuinely experts on any given subject can be counted literally on the fingers of one hand. And you can pick a subject. I mean, toss a coin, pick a subject. The number of people within the Indian government who can, with expertise, be able to speak on that is very, very small, which, for a country of 1 billion people, is something of an oddity. Second, the expertise is not born of specialization. And this is because of the traditional character of the Indian bureaucracy. It's a generalist bureaucracy. It comes out of a civil service tradition, which again was focused on maintaining a certain state of affairs rather than changing it, and therefore is actually ill-equipped to deal with the complexities of the modern world. It's a bureaucracy that, by the way, does not allow, with very few exceptions, for lateral entry. So you can be the world's greatest expert on X, but there is no way for you to help the government of India make smart decisions on X if you have not come up through the bureaucratic system of being trained as a bureaucrat and then finally reaching whatever your bureaucratic processes are. Third, there are very serious internal cleavages which have to be worked out if Raja's project is to be successful. And I just want to flag 2 cleavages that have to be engaged sooner rather than later. First is the ironclad cleavage between the civilian and the military. For a country that is an aspiring great power, and for a country that seeks to do effective grand strategy, you simply cannot have good policy making where the civilians and the military inhabit different universes and the twain don't meet. The second important cleavage is the cleavage between bureaucracy and elected officials. Elected officials hold all the power there is in the Indian political system, which is the way it should be. I'm not urging a revocation of the Indian Constitution as a way to produce better grand strategy. But unless you can find a way to marry the power of the politician with even the imperfect intuitions of the bureaucrat in a way that conduces to better policy making, we're not going to get where Raja wants to go. The last point is, and this is a cussed business, but it's a business that has to be accepted, is the discontents of policy making in any democracy. India is very large, is very self-absorbed, and is still in the process of becoming a modern state. Therefore, by definition, its gaze is inward-looking first and foremost. Grand strategy is in the category of the optional. Grand strategy is what you do when you're confronted with national emergencies. Most of the time, it's the humdrum business of keeping 1 billion people who speak 15 different languages and 700 different dialects organized together as one people. This is going to be hard to change. It's certainly not something that's going to change overnight. Let me end by saying a few words about the last set of challenges, which is in the slippery category, and I think can simply be summarized as cultural challenges, for want of a better word. To do grand strategy of the kind that Raja would see successful, you need to have a national leadership that takes power seriously. And above all, the exercise of power in the international system. Whether we like it or not, and there are complex, sociological explanations for this fact, the Indian leadership since independence has been very, very uncomfortable with the exercise of power. It is a cultural system that places a great premium on restraint. It's a cultural system that places a great premium on the reconciliation of competing alternatives. It is not a cultural system that takes kindly to choosing decisively among alternatives. If you give an Indian politician a choice between A and B, what he really wants is AB. This too will change. But until India evolves to the point where power is appreciated and the utility of power is recognized for the making of India's ends, the kind of grand strategy that Raja wants could be stillborn and could become just an academic exercise. Now, at the end of all of this, how do I see India's prospects for its ability to construct a grand strategy? I actually think they are quite bright, but with one qualification. India needs time. And I think sometimes we are unfair in our judgments of Indian capacity. It's important to recognize that in the United States, for example, where we take for granted the availability of institutions, the availability of individuals, it has been a long process getting to where we are. The United States became a great power in the global sense of the term somewhere around 1865. It had the first opportunity to exercise that power almost 100 years later, at the end of the Second World War. So it had in effect 80 years to get its act together, bureaucratically, institutionally, in terms of its ethos, in terms of its worldview. I don't know if India has another 80 years, but to expect an India that has barely tiptoed onto the global stage, not earlier than I would say probably the early 1990s, to be able to literally within the span of 2 decades do everything right may be expecting too much. But if we have to get to that end point where we would like to see India end up, and I say this as an American because we have a vested interest in India's success, then I think starting with Raja's book is not a bad place to start.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Admiral Menon. What I'd like to do is give you, Raja, about 5 minutes to respond to any of that you'd like to. Then we'll open the floor for questions.
Sure.
If you'd like. You can just stay put.
I can't agree more with the commentators. And I see that time is required, but I don't have any. I suppose one's got to adjust one's beliefs to this. There is the strongest bureaucracy, as Ashley quite very accurately pointed out, the strongest bureaucracy in India is the economic bureaucracy. Maybe it's a good thing, but their view is that we have to clock 9% for 15 years. Don't get in my way. 9% for 15 years means quadrupling the per capita income, takes India's per capita income to $10,000, and then we will talk. That's their view. But that's no reason to do everything else badly, as Ashley quite rightly pointed out. And a number of us have begun to point out that the British Empire, at the height of its power, generated less than 10% of the world's GDP. It punched above its weight. So merely because you are concentrating on one thing, it's no reason why your other institutions should perform suboptimally. But this, as you quite rightly said, this is going to be very tough to. The other is the rise of China. To say it again, the China's need to invest huge funds without getting it deeper into US debt is going to lead it, as it already is, into dumping capital equipment, money, and Chinese people all over the globe. And behind that dumping is going to follow geopolitical activity. And it is that geopolitical activity that is going to bring China into confrontation with the United States. And the last thing China will want at that stage is interference in its backyard from us. So as a prelude to all this, we are going to be encircled and bypassed. And we are going to keep quiet for 15 years. But that will just make the job tougher when we start protesting at what has happened. Lastly, reinvention of the United States. You can quote me any statistic, but I lived for 4 months in the United States in 2005, 2006, 2005, I think. And I was with the in Sandia in Albuquerque doing work on the nuclear deal. I was given a liaison of a PhD student who looked and was built like Tarzan. And the first thing I had to do was to buy a second-hand car. That's one of the last few of the genuine male pursuits. And Tarzan and I went to look for the second-hand car, which was advertised on the outskirts of Albuquerque. And we drove out and we hit the desert, and we finally came to this long building, which was the address. And we pressed the bell, and this foreign student came out and said, you guys have come for the car. You will have to wait a long time because I'm very busy with my accelerator. Now, I know that in India, what you call the gas pedal is called the accelerator. So I said, no, it doesn't take a 40-foot long building to fix an accelerator, a gas pedal. It must be the accelerator this guy is talking about. So we said, no, look, don't worry about the car. We just want to see your accelerator. And we went inside, and there was an accelerator there. It was being built by a PhD student in Albuquerque, and I said, didn't the FBI come and stop you or something? And he said, no. How did you build this? He said, I just put in a tender in the newspapers, and a lot of brass fitters and welders came, and he built. I mean, it wasn't as big as the one in France, but there it was. And I have never been so astounded by US innovation technology than by what I saw. And I'm not convinced that the United States is out of the fight yet. So all this goes into the book. And we'll have to be, I can see there's a lot of patience required. We've got to be patient with Pakistan to get its act together. And I think you're going to have to be patient that we get our act together. I think take the questions there.
Thank you, Raja. The floor is open. Who would like to start? Over here, please identify yourself and keep your questions succinct, to the point, please.
Hi, my name is Manohar Thiagaraj. Question for Admiral Menon. You mentioned no scenarios were written about India per se. The scenarios were external. But I presume that means that there was an assumption about India's trajectory. And I am still curious about what some of those underpinnings of those assumptions were, in particular India's innovative capacity. It does lag behind in many measures of innovative capacity. And education, of course. Only 18% of college-eligible students in India actually go to college. So, of course, Dr. Tellis touched on India's comfort with power, which was my third underpinning. But if you can comment on what some of the underpinnings are of India's trajectory, I'd be interested in that.
Should we take 2, 3 or what?
No, go ahead. You start there. I think that's a good place. It'll
Yeah,
stimulate others.
yeah, that's quite right. This is the issue that we dealt with in the book, and that is social stability in India's youth bulge. Between 2012 and 2025, when our population starts stabilizing, we're going to add 12 million people to the workforce every year. That frightens everybody. And there's no question that neither the private sector nor the public sector is actually creating that many jobs. In fact, most of the jobs are going to what's called the unorganized sector. You know, the guy selling peanuts on the street, and janitor, what you call janitors, and drivers. You know, the horrendous traffic conditions requires that you hire a driver. It's probably a good thing then, because out of the 5-6 million cars that we are selling, they're hiring 1 million new drivers every year. But the issue has been well put by a scientist who says that, you know, you got to take India like a train, and every year, those left over from the 12 million are going to be another carriage which is added to the train. And if you have another 6 million left over from the next year, there'll be another carriage left over the train. So this is the problem about the youth bulge. This is, if you're an optimist, you call it the youth dividend. And if you're a pessimist, you call it the youth bulge. But this 12 million is a serious business. And of course, somewhere in it is the fact that it isn't 6 million boys and 6 million girls. It's 7 million boys and 5 million girls. So you're going to have lots of, you know, what is derogatorily referred to as the Indian male, unemployed, unqualified, and without women too. So this is a problem, and that is the issue that we've dealt with in the book, which we think is so serious, from which flows everything else. You know, the need to get your economy growing faster, to create more jobs, to create more skills, and to get US universities into India and create more skills. Everything else flows from this one factor, which we think is the make or break factor for India.
Right here. Here, this one, right there. There you go. All right. Identify yourself, please.
Thank you, Anders. Yeah, I'm Rajesh Kedi, and I've done some writing on India. And Raja, of course, just a quick remark on the Indian male. It's the rutting male, so there's much more for the Indian male to be going forward. But my question is more is quite different. You talked of the two spurts in the US at the beginning of the 19th or the beginning of the 20th century and the end of the 20th century. Both these spurts are also accompanied by massive immigration. 10% of the American population at that time and at this time is of foreign descent, first generation. Now, what do you see as the role of the Indian Americans as innovators, what model or what role do you see in promoting both Indo-US relations and in promoting Indian growth and innovation?
Thank you.
Thanks, Rajesh. It's a very good point. As I said, if you take Ashley's model, the US, we think the US is going to reinvent itself. Maybe a few years later than perhaps it could have, but for this downturn. But when it does, it's going to reinvent itself based on technology. In fact, we've taken a call in the book and we've said it's probably going to be alternative energy. But the issue is that when the largest percentage of Indians here are in high tech already. So whatever the area is that the US decides to reinvent itself in, it's going to be an area in which there's going to be a large population of Indians. We have already had a fallout from this in the sense that both Narayan Murthy and Azim Premji are imports. They are imports from the United States. So this new area, which probably be a combination of nano, bio, and alternative fuel, will require a huge amount of back office work. And I think that is where India, as I briefly referred to, is going to ride on your coattails. And we'd like to see you take off, really. Yeah.
Ashley, Lisa, do you want to jump in on any of these?
Well, I would just make the point that on the issue that Raja raised, the ideal outcome is a growing symbiosis between the Indian and the American economies. Because what you have is a virtuous product cycle shift, where as the American economy moves towards the high end of the value chain, there are many industries and many skills which we either have to let go of or which we have to subcontract to others in different parts of the world. And to my mind, if it can be done in a way that bring the United States and India together, then it gives both countries a chance to enjoy the synergies that come from that kind of collaboration. I mean, healthcare is a very good example. Education is a very good example where something like this could be done.
Ambassador Tezzy Schaefer.
Tezzy Schaefer from CSIS. I was thinking about Ashley's comments about policymaking being done based on the instincts of a very thin layer of senior bureaucrats. I think there's more to it than instincts. There is a prevailing concept of what's good for India internationally. It certainly is bound up in this idea of strategic autonomy, which crudely translated for a Washington audience means not looking as if anybody else, guess who, might be having too much influence on India's foreign policy. And there are also still, even at a time when the United States is clearly India's most important outside relationship, there is this desire to be a balancer and to have a special relationship with the third world, even as India is considered one of the poles in a multipolar system. My question, which really comes back to Raja and his concept of what Indian interests are as one puts together or doesn't put together a grand strategy. Are these traditional ways of thinking about foreign policy and about India's international interests, do they still serve India's interests well? If not, what does it take to change them?
Thank you, Tezzy. Roger, why don't you lead off, and
Yeah.
I'm sure the others will have a
I'll
few
take-
thoughts too.
I'll take traditional ways. I think what I mean, I understand you to mean issues like multinationals are not national entities. And for India, a globalized new world meant that multinationals were increasingly coming into India and acting for interests that were totally undefinable. In other words, balance sheet, the shareholders' balance sheet. But we've become one of the biggest Asian creators of multinationals. So there isn't any shortage of bold Indian entrepreneurs who are willing to jump onto the bandwagon, put money into Nigeria or South America. And I think that was an attitude of the past when words like autonomy and autarky sort of went together. I think things are changing. You can frighten anybody in the Indian Armed Forces today on the grounds that he can't get anything from abroad because they will shut off the tap when it comes to spare parts. But when you analyze the history and ask for specific incidents of how often has this happened, and you find that all that people can really point out to is over 25 years some gearbox has been denied. You know. It doesn't create enough inspiration to prove that dependency abroad is debilitating. So I think there is this battle going on because interoperability in defense and getting into the same product cycle in the commercial world is going to push countries into globalization. And I think this is an irreversible step, which would be a mistake to hold off on the grounds of the beliefs that we held 20 years ago.
Lisa?
Yeah, I would just add to that, I think the study itself acknowledges that the U.S., or, as a unipolar power, would likely be more effective in dealing with some of the global challenges that we face than multilateral organizations. So I think, we will start to see a shift in the traditional Indian foreign policy of really looking to the UN or the multilateral organizations and having more confidence maybe in dealing bilaterally, allowing the U.S. To be more involved in dealing with some of these issues. I think that certainly will start to play out. And I think it also, you have to look at the historical relationship with Russia. And I think the study notes out that, or notes that India will have to balance its sort of new relationship with the U.S. with its old historical ties with Russia. And so certainly I think this new grand strategy thinking is going to impact inevitably the traditional foreign policies.
Ashley?
Well, I just want to make the point that I agree with you, Tazy, that there are intuitions that senior decision makers have. And they have some sort of an abstract sense of the goal, strategic autonomy or whatever you define. But where I still see a big hole is in the capacity to do analysis of alternatives. I mean, everyone knows that India wants to get somewhere, whatever that somewhere is. But there is no one single path to that somewhere. And what I find a weakness is that the system does not have the capacity to say, given our objectives, can we do first identifying what the alternative strategies are, and then looking at the costs and benefits of each of these alternatives? I mean, it's slowly beginning to happen, but most Indian decision makers have a certain fairly inchoate kind of sense of where they want to go. And their analysis of means is done literally in one's head. They kind of think of the alternatives, and that's useful. I mean, you obviously don't want people not to think. But I think to be able to do it systematically, where someone is tasked to come up with the alternatives, get the views of the experts in different ministries, et cetera, and then create options for decision, that I don't think we're there yet. Now, when the National Security Council was formed, that was the explicit intention. The explicit intention was that the National Security Council would be the body that would produce these options and alternatives. And once the National Security Council provided the alternatives papers to the proper National Security Council principles, and a decision was made, that decision would then go to the Cabinet Secretariat, and the Cabinet Secretariat would then put it up to the ministries for line-level decisions. So what they tried to do was marry the best of the American system and the Westminster system. In effect, what has happened, the National Security Council simply duplicates what line-level officers in the government of India do. That is not an advance in the direction which I think Raja would like to see. So either you kick the National Security Council out of the business of servicing day-to-day issues and give them the long-range planning function, or you create a new institution to do that. And I don't think they have engaged that question yet.
Right here, we have a couple down front. Here comes a microphone. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Shuja Nawaz at the South Asia Center of the Atlantic Council. Raja, you mentioned China, and I was wondering if we could look at the India-China relationship. Already the trade relationship is growing, and in some cases surpassing the India-US relationship. How do you see this emerging as a zero-sum game, or are there possible advantages, particularly given the current trends of Indian wages with the higher expectations of people coming onto the wage force, demanding higher and higher wages? Do you see this kind of interdependence between China and India growing?
Uh, Shuja, very frankly, we are totally mystified. But we look towards the United States to see how they look at their problem. And we get the impression that they are equally mystified. Because, you know, we get the impression that the Chinese don't read Morgenthau, you know. We don't know what they read. But you have a huge trade relationship with a country with which you have a bad political relationship. And you go on pushing the trade relationship. This is what China's been doing. So a lot of us have been asking constantly in the last 10 years, are we witnessing a new theory of international relations where, you know, international relations is run on dual tracks? Or will one day the two converge somewhere? Or will one submerge the other? The reason why I say we are mystified is, you know, we have a trade figure of 40 billion. It's grown very fast, as you quite rightly say. But we can't admit that, I mean, we can't pretend that things are not very good on the geopolitical arena. But then we look to the United States and say, but my God, they've got 250 billion trade relationship. And their political relationship seems just as bad. So how do you handle this? What we are certain is this 40 billion is not going to influence the political relationship if your 250 billion doesn't influence your political relationship. So I'm frankly mystified. And I'll have to look at people who taught me net assessment to see what is the outcome of this. But we need to bring this together at some time and see what's going to happen in the world where I know there are bizarre examples, but those were bad ones in the past. Like the United States was the chief supplier of hydrocarbons to Japan when it bombed Pearl Harbor. And so were you the chief suppliers of scrap metal or something from which they made steel. So that was a different world. This is a different world. And how does it run today? I'm frankly mystified.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have exhausted our time. I know there are lots of questions remaining. Am I right, Phil? We're due to wrap up at 2. Can we stay a little longer? Ashley, your schedule's the critical one. All right, we'll stay a bit longer. And right here in front, I promised. I've got all kinds of hands.
Surjit Manston, American University. Raja, I have 2 questions based on something I wrote quite recently. One is about this demographic bulge. Now, the UPA government has come out with rather ambitious and good-sounding schemes, both for education and for imparting skills, because without that, it would be a demographic disaster. Which are the elements within the society and the polity that are resisting that? Because it seems to me that there's a great resistance. And the second question is about civil-military relations. It seems to me that at least the armed services and their associated think tanks have been making quite an effort to gain a voice in at least building national consciousness and national consensus. How far do you think that has gone? And how far do you think that is likely to go to do what Ashley pointed out, and anybody thinking about India would point out, that this schism is out of date and non-needed?
Thank you. Raja?
You know, these 2 ministers were here, and I hear that what they've been discussing is something very big with the United States. The United States universities are all going to come, but provided this bill is tabled in Parliament now, which will enable the US universities to come. But what I want to say is, I think the figures is something like India produces 22,000 engineering graduates, but a year. But the companies like HCL, Infosys, Azim Premji's group and all these have on their own created something like 120,000 graduates, graduate equivalents. So what is really happening in India is that 50% of primary school students are educated in 10% of private schools. So what's happening is that the poor Indian is willing to spend 60% of his salary getting his kid a good education, and he doesn't want to go to a government school. So this is a new phenomena. The mutual funds are getting into education. In fact, somebody came to me and I was appalled when he said, I guarantee you 33% education if you invest so many hundred thousands in private education. I mean, this is happening. And what they're saying is that, for instance, the DAV school, all Indians are familiar with. It's the old Arya Samaj thing which started schools in Punjab in the 40s. They've got 1850 educational institutions which are being taken over by these mutual funds, which are going to revolutionize Indian education. So what's going to happen in India in the next 5 or 10 years is, it looks to me like it's going to go completely past the education minister. I get the feeling that he has realized this, and he would rather flow with it and let the private people create skills. Like for instance, the biggest money-making educational institution today are those coaching poor Indians to join the Indian bureaucracy. And there is a school in Bihar which guarantees 40% success. And these people are taken straight from the village school. So what's happening there is completely different. Civil-military relations, a lot of us are working on it. There is a new atmosphere quite frankly, as a result of this new NSA. And I don't know, if give it a few years and let's see where we may get. I think you will see this deadlock if it breaks, if you see the appointment of a CDS or somebody like that. I mean, the CDS today is prevented from coming in because of advice given by some really old coots from the Congress who advised that, the military is bad enough, but if you put all the military under one, it's a recipe for a coup. I mean, they don't realize the last thing the military have on their mind is wanting to rule India. So,
We'll take two more questions. The first one's back here on the aisle, and the second will be John Fonte right here.
Good afternoon. I'm Fahim Hashimi, a Fulbright fellow from Afghanistan, and currently working as an intern for Hudson Institute. My question is directed to Mr. Admiral. Despite of increasing concern of Pakistan from Afghan and India getting closer in different field, and how do you see the future? Where and how prosperous do you see the future of India and Afghanistan relationship in different aspects in the future? Thank you.
Some views here.
Yeah. I've never met an anti-Indian Afghan. I've never. And I've met them in all countries, in India, in Pakistan, in London, in New York, in Washington. I've never met an anti-Indian Afghan. I met lots of anti-Pakistan Afghans. I've been assured on really advanced track 2 fora that Pakistan has now accepted that nuclear weapons is strategic depth. They don't need geographical strategic depth. I think I was delighted to hear that. You're most welcome to nuclear weapons if you will stop messing around in Afghanistan. But eventually, this issue is for the Afghans. if the Afghans are left to themselves, they will create a political entity at some stage. I'm certain about that. It will take a long time because you didn't have a polity. From a tribal society to create a polity, it's going to require time. So, but when that is formed, I think the relationship with India can't be anything but good.
Ashley, Lisa, what?
Not on this subject.
Yeah. John Fonte, you have the last question.
John Fonte, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute. There's only a handful of democracies that did not ratify the International Criminal Court and didn't ratify Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions. These have issues to do with, of course, the laws of war. U.S. and India, Israel also, but U.S. and India is the largest. And this also includes, besides the International Criminal Court, is that Protocol 1. So these are questions of global governance, in a sense, versus democratic sovereignty. The question is a democratic nation state deciding how to defend itself. You mentioned the EU, and that's not apparently one of your drivers, but a major goal of the EU is what the International Criminal Court was an EU project. And they're seeking a promotion of global governance which restricts the democratic state. So what I'm thinking on here is a possible conversion of values and of viewpoints between the U.S. and India on the values and the grounds of democratic sovereignty, that a self-governing people has the right to determine its own rules of war. The United States and India agree on this, but the EU and most European states now do not. So this is for anybody who wants to comment. I'm seeing an ideological values convergence on these issues.
Thank you. Raja, we'll go with you first.
I must tell you that if I was asked to qualify what is the greatest achievements of humanity in the last 50 years, I might list one of them as the fact that we actually brought 5 heads of state to trial. I concede that. I mean, we brought certain heads of state to trial for committing genocide. I think it's a damn good thing. And the fact that the world has actually done this as a result of the ICC is something which a lot of Indians, certainly I am, full of admiration for. But there are some other issues. And this comes from the fact that we are the largest multi-religious, multi-ethnic democracy in the world. And when we saw the Soviet Union collapse, followed by Yugoslavia's collapse, the third largest multi-ethnic, we began to get nervous. I mean, holding a country together, as Lisa said, holding this huge country together, I think Ashley said that, is a problem. And we are constantly having to fight insurgencies. And quite often, the insurgents are really looking for political space. Now, if we are going to get targeted for creating a unitary federation and the way we fight, because we have to fight, when people in Europe say, well, if they want to become a free country, why don't you let them form a free country? And we say, mind your own business. We are a geographical entity. I mean, if you look at the 4 pillars that Ashoka put up in 300 BC, that defines India. We want that India. We don't want anyone telling us you should have a smaller India or a half India or a quarter India. So, you get some funny situations like an inspector in the BSF was refused a visa to go to Canada because some immigration fellow in Canada says, oh, you belong to the BSF. I think you committed some atrocity. I don't know which one, but but I think you could have committed an atrocity when you were employed against the Sikh insurgency in Punjab or against the insurgency in Kashmir. That is the thin end of the wedge. So I don't think any educated Indian would deny the fact that the ICC is doing a great job. And we see and we heartily approve of those guys who are being tried. In fact, we'd like to send you a list. You can take a few more and try them in The Hague. But I think we'll get there. Just be a little patient.
Lisa?
Yeah, I think certainly we shouldn't downplay the fact of India and the U.S. both valuing democracy, democratic principles, individual freedom, rule of law, respect for minorities. These are values that underpin both of our societies, and that's very important. And I think this was stated during Prime Minister Singh's visit here by both President Obama and Prime Minister Singh. But by the same token, I don't think India is ready to make that a basis for an alliance. I don't know if you're talking about some kind of, alliance or, structure. I don't think, we can take it that far. I think, these are values that we share. They make us have converging interests, often in different parts of the world. But at the same time, just sharing these values is not enough as a basis for an alliance as such.
Ashley.
Well, I'll just say on the question of the ICC, the issue of sovereignty is actually what unites us. The United States values its sovereignty because it's powerful, and we don't want lesser mortals pushing their fingers into things that we think is properly our own business. The Indians value sovereignty because they're a relatively weaker state, and they don't want more powerful states telling them what they should and should not do. So there's a perfect marriage of the minds. I remember when we had the first discussions with India, I was actually at the embassy in Delhi in 2001, I think it was late 2001, on the ICC. And we went in expecting that we would get a long speech on international norms and stuff like that. It was the quickest meeting in memory. It took all of about 3 or 4 minutes, and I remember Jayant Prasad, who was the Joint Secretary for the Americas, and we said, this is our position on the ICC. What do you think? He said, well, I'll read the paper later, but what's it? What's the position? We said, well, we don't like it. So he said, oh, great, we don't like it too. Yeah. On to the next subject. No, I think the sovereignty issue is something that, for different reasons, the US and India will converge on many issues. Now, obviously, the prospects for fluctuation are greatest at our end, because there are political oscillations in American politics that push you in one direction or the other. But given India's weakness, I don't think they are about to trade up on sovereignty issues anytime soon.
The book is The Long View from Delhi, to define the Indian grand strategy for foreign policy. I think you will agree with me that this has been a very stimulating conversation. It's a very stimulating book. Go out and buy it, and I get no percentage, but it is available. These little sheets they handed out are the ways to pre-order it. I think probably Amazon's got it by now, so one way or another you'll find it. I want to thank you, the audience, and especially our extended audience on the internet, for joining us here today for a very, very lively and fruitful discussion. And I want to thank our panelists, Lisa Curtis, thanks so much, Ashley Tellis, and of course, Admiral Raja Menon, the author of this book. Thank you.
Do you know about this new TV show that's coming on in the US about India?